All right, so are you ready to go deep on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films? It's going to be a wild ride through like almost 50 years of horror movie history. We've got 9 films to cover. Originals, remakes, prequels, the whole thing. We're going to really break it down and explore how this iconic and sometimes super controversial series has scared the heck out of people for generations.
It is fascinating how this franchise has stayed relevant and honestly, just scary for so long. We'll get into the details on all the films, but I think to really get it, to understand why it works so well, we got to go beyond the gore, though there's definitely a lot of that. And look at how it uses these really deep fears: family, isolation, the unknown. And it wraps it all up in this gritty, almost documentary-style realism. You see it especially in the original film.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about that realism because that original 1974 film, it's a game changer. It wasn't some big budget Hollywood thing. It was grainy, low budget.
Yep.
And it used these really unsettling sounds that got under your skin.
Totally.
And then there's Leatherface. I mean, can you even imagine seeing him on screen for the first time, chainsaw going?
Oh, yeah. Nightmare fuel.
Pure nightmare fuel. And that's what makes it work so well. It's like you're watching something you shouldn't be watching, even though you know it's just a movie. That dinner scene with Sally, she's the final girl, right? The one that gets away. It's a masterclass in tension. It's not jump scares.
Yes.
Or special effects. It's pure psychological horror, the kind of stuff that gets under your skin and just stays with you.
Ugh, that ending still gets me. Sally escaping, Leatherface in the sunrise swinging that chainsaw,
Yeah.
laughing. That image, it sticks with you. No wonder it became a cult classic. And that it inspired so many other films.
Oh, it's true. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre didn't just become a classic. It, set the stage for all these slasher movies that came after it. Before Texas Chainsaw, horror was a lot of times about monsters or the supernatural. But Texas Chainsaw made it real. Like, the scariest monsters might just be human. And Leatherface, with that mask made of skin and that chainsaw, he became like a symbol of all that, of that human darkness.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, the franchise didn't just stick with that same formula. The sequel, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which came out in '86, it totally went into black comedy and satire. It's a very different film.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. Toe Hooper, he directed both of them. He took a huge risk. I mean, it's like he decided, okay, let's just lean into how absurd all this is. So instead of making another film just like the first one, he gave us this over-the-top, almost cartoonish Leatherface. And that chainsaw duel, I mean, it's funny and scary at the same time.
Yeah, it's wild. It's got Dennis Hopper running around with a chainsaw trying to get revenge. You've got this radio DJ who accidentally records a murder. And then their underground lair is filled with bones and these weird sculptures. It's so much. Some critics said it was too much.
Yeah.
That it wasn't true to the original. But it definitely showed that the franchise wasn't afraid to try new things.
Oh, for sure. And it's a great example of how a sequel can play with your expectations. Like, you see sequel and you think you know what you're going to get. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 says, no, you don't know what's next.
Which brings us to the next 2 films. And this is where it gets, well, messy.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly. The next 2, Leatherface. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the third, that was 1990, and then Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the next generation in '94. They really had trouble, I think, finding what they wanted to be. It's really interesting to see what happens when a franchise loses its way a little bit.
Yeah, with Leatherface, they were trying for that darkness from the original.
Yeah.
But they had a bunch of production problems and issues with censors and that golden chainsaw with the Saw's family engraved on it.
It's like almost too much.
Right. And then there's the next generation. Well, it's strange. It's got dark comedy, weird situations, and the plot is all over the place.
It really is its own thing.
It's definitely the odd one out, but it does have one thing. Renee Zellweger and Matthew McConaughey were in it.
That's true. Early roles for both of them. You got to find the bright side, right? But as far as the franchise goes, those 2 films feel like they were just trying to figure things out, see what worked, what didn't.
So after all that, they decided to go back to the beginning. In 2003, we got a remake of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Pretty big deal.
Yeah, it was. It was a smart move. Think of it like this. You have this classic film that everyone loves, but maybe it feels a little dated. So the remake takes all the good stuff, that isolation, the brutality, that sense of dread, and updates it.
And they cast Jessica Biel as Erin, the final girl. She was great. She brought this strength to the character.
Yeah.
And vulnerability. The other big change was they shifted from the Sawyer family to the Hewitt family, which added a new layer. It wasn't just about cannibalism. It was about Leatherface's deformity and how his messed up family made him that way.
Yeah, it was a clever way to bring the franchise to a new audience and also add something new.
Which leads us to the prequel, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Mm.
The Beginning, from 2006. This one showed us Leatherface's first kill and how he went crazy.
It was really brutal. You see how he grew up, the abuse, his family's values. It's dark and disturbing, but it helps you understand Leatherface better.
And Arlie Ermey was terrifying as Sheriff Hoyt, the twisted father. That scene where he makes one of the characters run while Leatherface gets ready to kill him.
Yeah.
So chilling.
It is. Some people thought it focused too much on the violence, that it lost some of the suspense from the original, but it really cemented Leatherface's place as a horror icon. But then things get interesting. Again, the franchise changed again.
Oh yeah, Texas Chainsaw 3D came out in 2013, and it was a direct sequel to the '74 film. They completely ignored all the other sequels and the remake. What were they thinking?
It was a bold move, for sure. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that Texas Chainsaw 3D adds a new idea about Leatherface, the idea that he might be sympathetic.
Sympathetic Leatherface. That's a tough one to believe.
I know, right? He's still a killer, but there are hints that he's also tragic. He even ends up working with his cousin to get revenge on this mob that attacks their family.
I will say, that scene where his cousin throws him the chainsaw and says, "Do your thing, cuz," is both hilarious and terrifying. But did it work? Was it successful trying to make him sympathetic?
That's the big question, isn't it? It divided the fans. Some people liked it, seeing it as giving him more depth, while others felt like it ruined the character. The film itself used a lot of 3D, which felt like a gimmick. It didn't add much to the story. But it did set the stage for another reinvention. In 2017, we got Leatherface, and this one focused on Leatherface as a teenager.
So instead of more gore and chainsaws, we got a psychological origin story. Unexpected.
It is. This one takes us back to his childhood. We see how hard it was for him growing up and the really awful things that happened to him, things that might have made him snap. It's a slow burn. It focuses more on his psychology than on violence. It's trying to get inside his head.
So we see him as a kid who is struggling with these dark urges, not just a monster.
Exactly. Leatherface is trying to show that it's not just good versus evil, it's more complicated, and honestly, even more disturbing. It makes us think about what makes a monster.
But if I remember correctly, not everyone loved this new Leatherface either.
You're right. Some people thought it was interesting, while others felt like it went against everything we knew about him. Like it didn't work as a prequel. It's almost like the franchise is fighting with its own history, trying to figure out what to do with Leatherface. But one thing's for sure. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't finished. In 2022, we got another sequel, and this one, just like Texas Chainsaw 3D, ignored everything but the original.
So back to the original, trying to recapture that magic.
It's more than that. The 2022 film is part of this legacy sequel trend that was happening in horror, like the 2018 Halloween. They brought back Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode to face Michael Myers all these years later. The 2022 Texas Chainsaw did the same thing. They brought back Sally Hardesty, the final girl from the first film, to fight an older, even more brutal Leatherface.
Interesting. So they are acknowledging the other films, but also trying to do something new.
Yeah.
But it was just old characters, right? They also try to make it about more than just a slasher film.
Yeah, you're totally right. They use the gentrification of this small Texas town as the setting. It's like they're saying something about America changing, about the clash between the old ways and the new ways. Whether it works or not is up for debate, but it adds a whole other layer to the film.
So we've got a legacy sequel that tries to honor the original, bring in new ideas, and make a statement. What did people think?
Like with the other films, it was mixed. Some people felt like it had that same terror as the first film, while others thought it felt forced, not original. But one thing is for sure. It put Leatherface back in the spotlight and got everyone talking about what Texas Chainsaw means and why we're still fascinated by it. And that's what's so great about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, right? They just don't fit into one box. They're always changing, reflecting how horror has changed, even how society changes. But even with all these different styles and all the different Leatherfaces, there are these themes, these core themes that run through all the films. They tie it all together.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've seen Leatherface reimagined like a million times, but there's just something about these themes that keeps bringing us back. Like family. Family is a huge part of every film.
Yeah, but it's like a twisted, messed up family, right? The Sawyers, the Hewitts, they're not like normal families. It's blood that ties them together, but it's also something darker, something a lot darker. They don't follow the rules of society. They reject those traditional values, and I think that makes them both repulsive and fascinating.
It's like they're the dark side of the American family, the stuff we don't want to think about.
Yeah.
And that brings us to Leatherface. He's a product of all that. shaped by the cruelty and the insanity that's all around him.
Exactly, and that's what makes him so interesting. He's not just some monster. He's got a soul. But it's twisted, warped by how he was raised. You almost feel bad for him, even though he does horrible things.
Yeah, it's a weird feeling. You're scared of him, but you also wonder, what if he had been born into a different family? What if he had had a normal life?
That's what makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film so powerful. They make us think about those questions we don't really want to answer. And talking about things that make us uncomfortable, we can't skip over the big one, right? Insanity. It's everywhere in these films.
Oh, it is.
It's in everything.
He's a big part of it.
From Chop Top's rambling in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 to how the family just goes about their business like it's normal. I mean, it's clear that something is wrong with these people. Really wrong. They're not just weird. They're living in a different reality.
And that's what makes it so scary for us watching. We want to think there's a line between sane and insane. But the films blur that line. They make you wonder, what if? What if there's a little bit of that darkness in all of us?
Makes you think, huh?
Okay, I need a second to think about that. I'm going to hit a little close to home. But okay, while we're talking about things that make us uncomfortable, we have to talk about it, right? Cannibalism.
Yeah, we do. It's there from the very beginning. That dinner scene in the original, Sally at the table with Leatherface and his family. It's rough. And it keeps coming back in different ways throughout the films. It's about our fear of being eaten, of becoming part of something monstrous.
It's primal. It's like in your gut. You want to look away, but you can't.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they handle cannibalism differently in the different films.
Oh, yeah, you're right. In the original, it's about survival. This family, out middle of nowhere, they have to eat. But as the films go on, it becomes more of a symbol tied to family and insanity, the things we were just talking about.
Yeah, like they're not just eating people. They're trying to consume the whole world and make it part of their reality.
Which brings us to another theme, survival.
Yes. The final girl. It's in every slasher film, but in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's different. It's more intense. These women aren't just running from some guy with a mask. They're up against a whole family, and they're cannibals.
It's like they're fighting to stay human, and the films don't hold back. They show how brutal that fight is. Oh, for sure. These movies are not for everyone. It's violence, disturbing images. It's meant to scare you, to push the limits. And that brings us back to Leatherface. He's at the center of it all. He's what makes these films so shocking and disturbing.
And he's so complex. We've seen him as this scary monster, as this almost sympathetic guy, even as this messed up kid who doesn't know who he is. It's like every director wants to explore a different side of him.
It's true. And it's led to some really interesting Leatherfaces. And some that people hated, like in Texas Chainsaw 3D. That decision to make him kind of sympathetic, to have him work with his cousin, people really didn't agree on that one.
Some loved it. They thought it made him a better character. Others hated it. They thought it ruined him.
And then you've got Leatherface from 2017. That one goes the other way. It's all about his messed up childhood, trying to show how he became a monster. It's more about psychology, makes you think about nature versus nurture. But again, not everyone liked it.
It's like they can't make up their minds. Do they make him more human or keep him as this pure monster? And I think that shows up in how they make the films. Some are like the original, gritty, realistic, and then some are over the top, almost funny in a dark way.
It's a franchise that's always changing things up, trying new things, pushing boundaries, and that's what keeps it interesting. You never know what you're going to get with a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but you know it's going to be intense, it's going to be disturbing, and it's going to make you think.
Yeah, it's a wild ride, and I think that's why it's still so popular. After all these years, Leatherface is still a huge name in horror, and people are still scared of him. And those themes, they still mean something.
It's not just the gore and the scary parts. It's about something deeper, something darker. It's about looking at those parts of ourselves and those parts of the world that make us uncomfortable. And the truth is, those things are real.
Well said. So as we start to wrap up our look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where do you think it goes next? What's next for Leatherface?
That is the question, isn't it? A big one. What happens next for Leatherface and all the Texas Chainsaw films? It's tough to say because, well, we've seen how much this franchise likes to change things up, but I guess that's also what keeps it interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It just does its own thing. Just when you think you know what to expect, it does something totally different. But I think it's probably safe to say that people love these intense, thought-provoking horror films. So I bet there's always going to be room for Texas Chainsaw.
I think so, too.
It's tapped into something primal that people really respond to generation after generation.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how the franchises change, all the different Leatherfaces, those themes that are in every film, the things that make it so disturbing
Yeah.
and so interesting to watch. But what does it all mean? What's the legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
It's a complicated legacy, that's for sure. People have been talking about this franchise for almost 50 years, praising it, criticizing it, analyzing it, copying it. It's made people debate about violence in movies, about the nature of evil, about what's okay to show on screen. But there's one thing that everyone agrees on. Texas Chainsaw changed horror movies, and filmmakers today are still influenced by it.
Yeah, it's one of those like really rare franchises that has stayed popular and scary for decades,
Yeah.
which is super hard to do. It's not just a bunch of slasher films. It reflects what we're afraid of as a culture, and it's also about our fascination with the dark side of humanity.
Totally. And it's done all that using so many different styles. You've got the first one, that gritty, realistic horror, and then some of the later films are almost over the top, like dark comedies. But I think at its heart, it's about the stuff that really scares us, the darkness that's out there in the world. And also inside of each of us, it makes us think about the possibility that maybe the monsters aren't that different from us.
It's hard to watch, honestly. These films, they're made to make you feel something, to get under your skin, and to stay with you. But that's what makes them so good. They're not just trying to scare you, they're trying to make you think. And Leatherface is at the center of all of it. He's become this icon in horror. You see that mask and you know, and he's terrifying.
He's like this blank slate. You can see whatever you're afraid of in him. He's the unknown. He's unpredictable. He's that chaotic energy that could just mess up your life at any time. And even after all these years and all the different versions of him, he still scares people.
It really is amazing how a character like Leatherface can stick around this long and still mean something to audiences. I think it says a lot about the power of that original film and how the franchise has changed and adapted over time.
And it says a lot about how fascinated we are by the dark side of people. We may not want to admit it, but there's a part of us that likes these stories, these scary characters, the stuff that makes us uncomfortable and forces us to look at the world differently.
Yeah. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre reminds us that the world can be a dangerous place and that evil can be anywhere. It's like a warning, a reminder that the monsters aren't always hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're at the dinner table with you.
Yeah. And that's a really scary thought. A good way to sum up how disturbing these films are. They force us to ask ourselves questions that are tough to think about. They force us to look at the darkness in ourselves and the darkness that's all around us.
Well, we've talked about a lot. We've gone through the history of the franchise, the different leather faces, all the themes that keep popping up, and the impact that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre has had on horror. But as we wrap up, I have one last question for you. If you were the one making the next Texas Chainsaw film, where would you take it? Would you go back to that gritty realism of the original? Would you explore Leatherface as a person? Or would you do something totally new? Let us know what you think. Until next time, stay curious and maybe sleep with the lights on.